So if a lot of the practices are, I mean, like you mentioned tech that can help, I assume a lot of it is just education itself, like just changing the practices, and maybe the tech helps them to monitor or things like that. Like what kind of companies are you looking at that are helping this transition, and maybe go through some examples in your current portfolio?
Well,
I mean, so yeah, let's kind of let's do this together. We're very keen to stress that this is a whole value chain piece. It's not just on farm.
Right.
So
Okay.
we try and, from a portfolio construction perspective, make sure that we're completing a fairly holistic inclusion of that entire value chain.
So go through the value chain from the farm.
So from farm, we've invested into a company that lends to farmers that are transitioning.
Okay.
And that's US based, and they're one of the central existing hubs. They have a non-profit, which is very much a community building, best idea sharing piece. They've been around for a substantial amount of time, and they've kicked up an enormous stink. I say stink, a positive stink in the space. They then have a product that lends to these farmers, and it's been incredibly well received, and they're onto their second fund at the moment. Right. They're called Mad Capital, they've been a keystone to the entire space in the US. We've also invested into a company that looks at soil measurement, but is and then sells its technology to the laboratories in America. So it's a B2B play, but it's Raman spectroscopy. It's the most sophisticated way of measuring what's actually going on in a soil at a particular moment that we have. In the middle, we've actually not invested.
So just to go back to that one, so that would help obviously farmers as they change their practices, start to be like, oh, my soil's getting healthier now.
yes, we're providing visibility on things that up until fairly recently have just not been known at all.
Because that seems to be the way to just get as much data as possible. And then I guess with the birth of AI, applying that as well could be quite useful.
Exactly. So, one vision is that these technologies, such as the one that Chris has just referred to, are able to provide accurate decision support from how a farmer decides on their yearly crop plan to all of the management decisions that they make along that journey.
And then how that translates into the nutrition in the final food.
Yeah. But to unpack that slightly, soil biology is largely an unknown field, as in at the moment we have fairly low resolution data on the health of soils. So technologies that dramatically increase our visibility of soil health and then use AI trained against those data sets are in a very powerful position to provide farmers with decisions that will reduce some of those things that we were talking about. So the risk of a crop failing or the risk of a regenerative management plan creating a yield drag, you can minimize those effects. You can reduce the amount of capital that's required to transition by having intelligent data to inform decision making.
And what makes healthy soil? Is there, just to give a few ideas of markers, is it like the diversity of the microorganisms in it, or things like that, or what in?
Yes, it's about their diversity. It's not just about the biology. It's how the biology is interacting with the chemistry of the soil and the physical properties of the soil. So in a sense, those are the three dimensions. At the moment, sophisticated industrial farmers have a fairly good understanding of the physical properties of their soil, though certainly not perfect, but they have a good understanding of the chemistry of their soils.
Sure.
But biology is the missing part, because the chemistry has to flow through biology in order for it to...
It's amazing they managed to create such a massive industry with such little knowledge of such a key input into their production.
Yeah.
That's interesting. So this soil testing allows you to see a lot more information about the soil. And like, what were the other companies you were saying?
I mean, it is just your point. It is amazing how the central ingredient to farming soil has been absolutely, completely ignored, but very much in favor of, big food and ag. I mean, if you look at the usage of glyphosate over the last 20 years, for instance. It's amazing how exponential it's become as soils have depleted and they've needed to rely on inputs more and more. So it's played into the system, and that's
So the
why it's such a big.
So the chemicals inputs are somewhat to add nutrients to the soil, which are supposedly then helping the plants to absorb them, and the other chemical inputs are to kill things they don't want in the soil.
Yeah, fungicides, pesticides.
Yeah. And do you want to get rid of both or change them into more helpful ones?
What we've been doing in industrial agriculture is we've been mining the soil. It's probably the best way of describing it.
Okay.
And then in order to keep getting yields off that land, we introduce exogenous synthetic inputs in order to drive those outcomes. And that might be analogous to, let's say, a bodybuilder taking drugs.
Sure.
So it creates a short-term result, often a fairly superficial one, as in superficial in the sense that it's not as strongly correlated with strength, and it's definitely not correlated with long-term health.
I see. Okay.
So when you go back to a natural system, it's a completely different paradigm. Your soil has a propensity to regenerate. So if one was to go back, I don't know, however many millions of years, 400 million years, right back to the beginning of terrestrial life on Earth, algae and formed a relationship with other bacteria on the edge of the ocean, and that was a sort of a rudimentary ancient form of lichen, and that was the first plant. And it began to mineralize the bedrock that it was on top of, and when it died, it deposited a tiny amount of soil.
Right.
Fast forward to now, the world has built huge quantities of soil that has detoxified our atmosphere and made it livable for creatures on planet Earth, going back however far. So nature has built a soil as a cornerstone of how land functions as an ecology, has created habitable life on the planet.
Right.
So it is literally the medium through which everything around us has been transmuted.
Yeah, which is fascinating. I mean, after reading Merlin Sheldrake's books and listening to his audiobook and watching his movie, that's all about mushrooms and lichens and their role on the planet, it's just kind of blown my mind as well to just hear how they are able to extract nutrients from rock effectively, and then so you start, and they can survive through outer space, through the vacuum of space, which was fascinating. Then I started to think, wow, if that, these kind of fungal mycelium networks, you start to think what implication that might have, that could have been sent here to create life here, because if it can make it through space and it can land and start to extract minerals, etc., from rock, and then form the basis of kind of symbiotic relationships with bacteria that I believe had photosynthetic qualities to them, and then form the first basis of plant life, with the lichens being the first roots, and then plant roots came a lot after. It was always in
that's right,
collaboration, which is just kind of fascinating, and I think most people don't even know that stuff.
Yeah, organic life emanates in the most difficult habitats, like the vents at the bottom of the ocean. Extreme temperatures, extreme pressure, no oxygen, but the right chemical compounds with an energy source can manifest into rudimentary organic life forms.
Yeah, and fungus is doing quite a lot now, I understand, even with like radioactive waste. So they've managed to find fungus that can eat that.
That's right.
And, so it seems like there's no limit to what fungus can do in terms of eating. I think even plastics and stuff, there's some fungus being developed in that area. I think there's a lot to explore with fungus, and would love to get some experts in that field on at some point to look into that.
And then there's that thinking that at the point when we discovered cooking with fire and our brains really began to develop and grow disproportionately to other primates. There's also a theory that we were following particular herds of wildebeest across the Serengeti plains or wherever we were, and there was a particular type of psilocybin mushroom that was growing out of the poo left behind by these particular herds.
Right.
I mean, I think that's probably pretty unprovable, but it's
Sure.
it's interesting that there's a theory that correlated with this uptick in brain growth.
So what, they ate the mushrooms and then they were like, let's play with fire, and then,
Or the two things happening at the same time,
Right.
being coincidental almost.
see.
So there's some people that
100%.
think
I can see that. I mean, you see all the studies on psilocybin and the effect on the brain, and it's now that they've finally opened up again for scientists to use them in studies. You see some incredible results from people with PTSD and that were kind of resistant to other types of treatments, and how they've got through it, and how the use of mushrooms can light up all your brain and create new neural pathways and stuff. You can imagine that could have contributed towards a lot of our development early on.
It's hard not to see at every level that our evolution is, or our interaction with the fungal kingdom has been heavily influenced by their psychedelic properties.
Right.
I suppose neither of us being experts on psilocybin or mushrooms, but yeah, definitely interested in it. I think just on the whole value chain piece, just being interested in terms of like how the whole piece has exploded. One of the sections that we've been interested in is if supermarkets have played this disproportionate role in terms of feeding at least the UK, and obviously in America there are very few players feeding the US too. How genuine are any of their targets in terms of their nutritional targets for their customers over the course of the next year, 2, 3, 4 years, up to 2030? And is their scope 3 emissions and their supply chain and their biodiversity carbon footprint piece? And I think there's a range of how authentic supermarkets or any of the players in the middle perhaps are looking at this. But the most forward-thinking of those players are making positive steps forward. So perhaps usually not enough, but that might be sponsoring a large number of pilot projects in the UK to look at regenerative farming by some of the big European food players, which are working with some of the more advanced farmers in the space and are producing enough cash to actually monitor and produce research that is going to be, I think, genuinely useful and be part of pushing this wave from early adopter into a larger amount of the food production industry or the supermarkets.